B-I-B-L-E. Yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the Word of God. The B-I-B-L-E.
The B-I-B-L-E. Yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the Word of God. The B-I-B-L-E.
The B-I-B-L-E. Yes, that's the book for me. I stand alone on the Word.
Hey, Bob. What are you doing?
Nothing. Just cleaning up a little.
Well, today we are in part 2 of this discussion we're having around the Bible that we've called the Bible for grown-ups. And today's going to be a little bit of a unique discussion where it's going to be more of a grown-up discussion, where there's going to be a lot of information, a lot of facts we're going to talk about. And so as we do, I really want to encourage you to kind of fact check the things we talk about today. So Google is your friend. Make sure to fact check this stuff. And in addition to that, don't forget to go to npaustin.com/Bible, because I'm guessing that you're going to have a lot of questions about maybe the discussion we're going to have today, or that you're going to have questions throughout this entire series. So I want to create a place where you can ask those honest, objective questions. And then what we're going to do is a little bit unique from what we've done in the past, is that we're going to take those questions, and every week, about midweek, we're going to do a podcast. And I'm going to try to answer those questions to the best of my ability. And then in the show notes of the podcast, we're going to provide some additional resources to the questions that are being asked. And in fact, we've already done one podcast. So if you haven't listened to that, make sure go to npaustin.com/Bible and you can check all that out. So with that said, last week as we began this whole discussion, we started this way. We said that most of us, if not all of us, are familiar at least with one Bible story. Maybe two for some of you in the room, or some of you watching or listening online. You may be Bible scholars and you may be familiar with lots of Bible stories. But even though all of us are familiar with Bible stories, very few of us are familiar with the story of the Bible. Like, how did we get the Bible? And that's really, really important for us to think about, because if you don't know the story of the Bible, it's easy to discount the stories in the Bible. In other words, as you kind of think about this, perhaps today you're here and maybe you've stepped away from faith or walked away from faith, or maybe you know somebody who's walked away from faith, or you've got a friend who's walked away from faith. And the reason why is because of the stories in the Bible. Because you're like, that's just not valid. That's just not, I just don't believe that. And so you've walked away, or you know somebody who's walked away. And last week we said that's understandable. Because if you don't know the story of the Bible, it's very easy to discount the stories in the Bible. To begin to think about the Bible and just say, hey, this is like any other religious work. There's really no difference between this and any other religious thing. And there's really no difference between the Bible and any other kind of historical work or works of antiquity. They're all pretty much the same. And so if they're all pretty much the same, then it's extraordinarily easy to begin to discount the stories in the Bible. And when you discount the stories in the Bible, it's easy to walk away. And last week we said this. I said, that's unnecessary. Like, you don't have to walk away. So let's take the time to begin to understand the story of the Bible and how we got that story. So we talked about that last week. And if you weren't here, I really want to encourage you to go online at npaustin.com. You can check out what we've said so far. And again, if you have questions, don't forget to ask those questions at npaustin.com/Bible. Now, today what I want to do, I want to continue this discussion. And I honestly want us to have this adult discussion, or kind of grown-up discussion. And you may be going, well, what does that mean? What are you talking about? And so to give you some context where we're going today, I want to share with you about a discussion I had in my office several months ago. And it was with this couple that sat down, and I hadn't met with them before, and so we sat down, and they began to talk about their story, and they shared kind of the context of their story. And then they had these topics that they were bringing up, and they said, Buck, we want to meet with you because we want to know where you're at with these topics. We want to know what you believe and why you believe what you believe. And so they presented these topics, and these topics are very polarizing topics. The topics they had questions about were topics that would impact their marriage and your marriage, and they would impact, in terms of the way we raise our kids. They would impact the way we see people in our culture. I mean, they were very, very kind of emotionally heated topics. And so they gave their opinions and a lot of their thoughts and a lot of context. And I sat there and I thought to myself, man, if I had experienced what you had experienced, gone through what you had gone through, I would have the very same kind of questions about these topics. So as they shared those, we got to a point in the discussion where it was appropriate, where I just said, hey, listen, I do have a question for you. Like, I'll talk about what I believe and why I believe in this discussion. But before I get there, I'm just curious, like just out of curiosity, all of our opinions and all of our thoughts are based on something. There's something we pull from that inform our opinions and thoughts. And I'm just curious, where are you pulling from? Like, is there, a philosopher that you're pulling from? Is there, historical things that you've read? Is there a book that you've read? Like, I'm just honestly, genuinely curious as you share those opinions, where the kind of the root of those opinions are from. And as I asked that question, they just kind of sat there and they thought, and then finally they looked at me and they said, well, that's just based on our experiences. And it's based upon our feelings. And if you heard the context of the discussion, that made sense. But then I asked them, I said, well, what about the Bible? Because the Bible talks about these things. In fact, Jesus had a lot to say about these. What about the Bible? And immediately when I asked that, the husband kind of looked up and rolled his eyes and laughed, and he said, Buck, are you kidding me? The Bible? I mean, that thing is so ancient. That's from 2,000 years ago, written by a bunch of peasants for peasants. I mean, are you kidding me? That has no relevance to our discussion today. And I thought to myself, there it is. There it is. There's the tension. And there's the question that I want us to answer, which is, can you trust the Bible? Specifically, can you trust the New Testament? Because the New Testament points to the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And guys, this question has huge implications for your life and for my life. Because here's the deal. You see, if the Bible is myth, fiction, and superstition, I mean, if this is true, like if this is all it really is, then honestly, game over. Like for real, if the Bible is just made up, if it's myth and superstition, we should all go home, for real. Like the time that we give, serving, investing our finances, coming together, this whole facility, getting your kids ready, doing all that kind of stuff. If it's purely myth, then that means that Jesus is also purely like, hey, maybe he was a person, but he's not who he claimed to be. And if he's not who he claimed to be, he didn't come back from the dead. And the Apostle Paul said, if Jesus didn't come back from the dead, game over. Like, what are we doing, guys? And so if the Bible, if the New Testament is just fiction and superstition, we should all be playing golf this morning. We should not be here, but bundled up in some warm clothes because it's kind of chilly outside, right? But I mean, that's the case. Now, the reason why this is important, because if the Bible's superstition and not true, we should game over. But if the Bible can be trusted, game on. I mean, this is the real deal. If the Bible can be trusted, the New Testament documents point to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if Jesus Christ is real and he rose from the dead, that really means you can have peace with God. Like, that's real. That really means God loves you and that God demonstrated his love for you through his son, Jesus Christ. If the New Testament documents can be trusted, that means that you can really have a new identity. Like, your identity doesn't have to be found in anything out there in culture, that your identity can be brand new. You can be a new creation through Jesus Christ. If the New Testament documents can be trusted, that means that you can find peace. Like, it's possible to find a peace that transcends all understanding. And if they're true, that means eternity's real. And that means one day you will see your loved ones again. So guys, this is an important discussion. So the question is, can you trust it? For real. Like, if somebody was to ask you, can you trust the New Testament? What would you say? And why would you say what you say? So as we think about that, If you and I were just talking and we were going, okay, can we trust this thing? You know, the New Testament, is it real? Is it accurate? Is it historical? You know, is it unique? If so, what is it? If we were talking about that, you know, I think we should start where most, you know, historians would start. I think we should start the conversation where most archaeologists or people kind of in that field of study would start. They would start with historical documents with the manuscript evidence. They would go, well, first, is there any manuscript evidence? Like, we need to substantiate it there. And when it comes to the New Testament, what's interesting to think about is the New Testament is written on two types of material. So the ancient documents in the New Testament, it's written on papyrus, which papyrus comes from the Nile River. It's these reeds in the Nile River that they would pull from the Nile River. They would dry the reeds, and then they would glue them on top of one another. Think about plywood, like kind of how that's made. Same kind of process. So they would dry these reeds, stack them on one another, glue them on one another, and then you would have, if you will, a piece of paper. And that's what they would write these old manuscripts on. And most first century, documents that we have or manuscripts that we have of the Old Testament are written on papyrus. Now, the thing about papyrus, it's very, very fragile. So over time, pieces would break off, and that would be very, very common. And in fact, what's cool today is if you got on an airplane and you went to Manchester, England, and you went to John Ryland's library, you could actually see this document right here, which is papyrus. And this is called P52. And P52 is significant because it's a part of the Gospel of John. You know, John, the one that Jesus on the cross said, hey, John, take care of my mom. That John, the one that lived in Ephesus with Mary. And today you can go to Ephesus and visit the place that most historians would say John lived. That John, that here's a piece of his letter or a copy of his letter. Now, what's so important about this, P52, is P52 is dated AD 130. Now, just think about that. If you paused a second, just thought about that historical timeline, you're like, okay, John wrote his letter, in the first, kind of late first century. That means that P52 is just a few years after the original that John wrote his letter. It's extraordinarily close. You think about that, that's just kind of interesting, or at least for me it is, because I like to geek out on these kind of things. So that's papyrus. The other kind of material that the New Testament documents were written on are called parchment. Parchment's animal skin, so predominantly sheep and goat skin. They would dry that out. But parchment, the thing about this, it was extraordinarily expensive. And it was very, very difficult. Especially in the first century to do this, you had to have a lot of money and all that kind of stuff. And so it was very rare in the first century to have parchment, but you do after going into the second, third, and fourth century. In fact, today, if you go to the British Museum, what you could see is what's called the Codex Sinaiticus. Now, this is so crazy significant, and let me tell you why. The Codex Sinaiticus is a complete copy of the entire New Testament. So all 27 letters of the New Testament. And the Codex Sinaiticus dates from AD 330. Now that's a big deal because the next complete New Testament with all 27 documents is actually 500 years later. So this is 500 years earlier, this entire New Testament, than any other complete New Testament than what we have. And today you can go look at it. In fact, this week I was telling my friend about, what we're talking about today. And he said, Buck, what's really cool is I went and saw this. I went to the British Museum and I stood there and I looked at the Codex Sinaiticus, and he said in the margins of this, he said there's all these notes of these, early church fathers and what they were writing. And he said under each one of these lines is like this faint line to keep everything cohesive. And he said, when I looked at it and I experienced that moment, he said, for me, it felt like a holy moment because he thought, look at all the history. And this is just a very short time after the life and the events of Jesus Christ that we have a complete New Testament right here before my eyes. So the point of all that is when it comes to these ancient manuscripts, specifically with the New Testament, they're written on two kinds of material, papyrus and parchment. Now, here's where the discussion begins to take a turn. Here's why all this is important. Because when you're looking at works of antiquity and you're trying to go, is it trustworthy? Can I put my weight into that? You've got to ask this question. How many surviving manuscripts do we have? Because if you have just a very few manuscripts, it creates a lot of questions. And it's hard to kind of have a checks and balances system. If you have a lot of manuscripts, you can have a checks and balances system to go, okay, obviously there's a lot of manuscripts, or do these manuscripts contradict one another? Is there consistency? And if a significant historical thing happened, you would imagine it would be documented more and more times. So the more manuscripts, the more that historical event would be significant. So if you were to take all the major works of antiquity, right? We don't have time to go through an exhaustive list, but if I was to kind of share with you, here's some works of antiquity that are well respected at academia, that today you would say, hey, these are some of the most valid ones that we have today. What would that be? So here's what that would be. First, we would have Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman historian. How many manuscripts do we have of Tacitus? Well, we have 31. And then you've got Plato. Plato was the Greek philosopher. How many manuscripts do you have of Plato? 210. And then you have Caesar. This is Julius Caesar. You have 251 manuscripts. And then you have Homer. Maybe you read this in school, Homer's Iliad, or Homer's Odyssey, that whole thing, is a Greek poet. And we have 1,800 documents from Homer. Now, this is significant because just a few years ago, we only had 652 documents from Homer. And then through an archaeological dig, they discovered some even more manuscripts. So now we have 1,800. So you guys see this last slide, but this, when you compare it to the New Testament, we have 24,000 documents, 24,000 works of antiquity. 5,800 of those are in Greek. Over 10,000 are in Latin. And then you have Syriac, you have Coptic, you have Armenian, you have Georgian, you have all these different ancient languages, that multiple copies of these ancient documents, 24,000. Now, if you just paused a second and just said, I'm not biased, I just want to be objective, I want to be intellectually honest about this whole discussion, you would say, well, goodness, something happened in history that would cause an explosion of manuscript evidence. This is such a big deal. In fact, I love what Professor F.F. Bruce at the University of Manchester, he kind of captures this, and I love what he says. He says, there is no body of ancient literature in the world which enjoys such a wealth of good textual attestation as the New Testament. And attestation means proof of or evidence of. In other words, F.F. Bruce says this. He says, hey, compared to all other works of antiquity, like they all kind of start at the starting line. When you look at the New Testament simply based upon how many manuscripts, it's at the finish line. There is no other work of antiquity like it. Now that's significant to think about, and if we're just talking, you would go, okay, it's a good data point, okay, as we're kind of building this case, can you trust the Bible? But what else? Well, what else we would need to do is not only look at the manuscripts and how many, but we need to ask this question. What is the time period between the original and the first witness or the first manuscripts? In other words, hey, this happened in history, and then we have the first documentation of it, right? So that's the original. And then we have copies of those manuscripts today that we can put our hands on, that we can go look at in museums. What's the time date? What's the gap from the original to the first witness? Well, if we go back to some major works of antiquity that are respected today, here's what you would find. Tacitus, 750 to 950 years. Plato, 1,300 years. Julius Caesar, 950. Homer's Iliad, 400 years. That's respectable. But then you look at the New Testament. And guys, this is so important to at least consider, to at least ponder. It's 50 years. It's 50 years. That is significant, and it sets it apart. It is the most distinct work of antiquity we have, these New Testament documents. In fact, I love the way that Sir Frederick Kenyon, he's the director of the British Museum, captures how significant this is. Here's what he says. And this guy is familiar. He sees all kinds of works of antiquity. He meets with all kinds of, academia, and they talk about this stuff and look at all these other historical works. And then he takes the New Testament. Here's what he says. He says, the interval then between the dates of the original composition and the earliest extant evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible. And the last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. And then look at what he says to wrap it up. He says, both the authenticity and the general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established. In other words, Sir Frederick basically says there is nothing we have in historical works like the New Testament. In other words, you could go so far to say this, to say, hey, if you cannot trust the New Testament documents, then you cannot honestly, objectively trust any other ancient work of antiquity. It is that distinct and that unique. So you hear that. And maybe that's new for you. Maybe that's like, I just didn't know. There's like, these data points or these subjective facts about the New Testament compared to any other ancient work. But the tension and the kind of the push against this is you would say, well, how do you know they're true? It's great. We have manuscript evidence, wonderful. And we have a short timeline, great. But how do we know they just didn't make that up? And then they copied it a lot of times. And then it was just basically fiction and it was just short. In fact, one of the big pushbacks against the New Testament is this idea that, hey, yes, a lot of manuscript evidence, yes, a short amount of time, but it's still 50 years and things can be distorted in those 50 years. And so the tension that a lot of skeptics will have against the New Testament is really around a game you played as a little boy or little girl and a game I played. And the game is called the telephone game. You guys remember this? This whole, idea, this may bring back some childhood memories. You remember it's this idea that, somebody over here has the original message, and then they whisper it over and be like, hey, here's the deal. And it kind of goes down the chain, and by the time it gets to the end, it's a completely different message. It's the idea of somebody with the original message that says something like this, hey, the Dallas Cowboys are back, and they're going to the Super Bowl. Anyone with me here? I feel pretty alone right now, right? But imagine that's the original message. And then it gets, 10, 15 people down here. And then they say at the end, they're like, hey, Backstreet Boys are back. And they're playing at the Super Bowl. You're like, what the heck, what are you talking about? I mean, it's just different, right? So we can kind of make fun and that's kind of childish things. But listen, this is one of the major pushbacks is to go, that's why you cannot trust the New Testament documents are historically and verifiably accurate. And part of the reason this has, been out there, and this is a pushback is because the telephone game. Now, here's what's really important to know. That's fair, and I think we have to deal with that. But part of how you verify that to go, is this true, is something called eyewitness knowledge profile. And an eyewitness knowledge profile is something you would do with all ancient works of antiquity that you're trying to get to the bottom of. Can we trust this? Is this real history? Did this really happen? And what this is where you take the original author or the eyewitness and you ask these questions and you actually do an exhaustive study on every single one of these. And you go, did the author know the geography of the place they talk about? Topography. In other words, when they said, hey, I walked up to the city, is that city actually up or is that city down? Because if the city's actually down, that would be inaccurate. That perhaps would discredit that manuscript. You look at agriculture, architecture, botany, like the flowers. They describe flowers. Are those flowers in that part of the country at that time in history? Economics, traditions, laws, languages, names. I mean, you think of the top 10 names of Sweden. If I said, hey, what are the top 10 names in Sweden? You'd go, I don't know. But if I said, what are the top 10 names in Austin? You may have a better idea. You've got to get this accurate in works of antiquity. So do the names fit the geography and that historical timeline, culture, etc.? So this is exhaustive. And there is so much research on this eyewitness, knowledge profile. Now, think about it this way. This is so important, so I would just want to kind of play this out a little bit more. Think about it this way. Imagine this. Imagine if I was capturing something in Greater Austin that is historical, that is awesome, that could change history. And I was to document it. As I would document that, I would include things like this. I would say, hey, in Greater Austin, I may talk about, it was around the time the Capital 10K was run, because I'm, familiar with that. And, it's over by the Magic Time Machine. I know that's not open any longer, but I used to go there as a little boy. It was awesome. And you remember Katz's Deli? They had the best milkshakes on 6th Street. It was awesome. I probably would include that in my letter somewhere. And then I would talk about the bats. bats under the bridges, and at certain times they come out and, talk about 6th Street, keep Austin weird. What is that all about? I talk about traffic patterns and stay off of I-35. It's ridiculous, at certain times. I talk about the orange UT Tower, although that's a little bit painful in this moment because it didn't light up orange last night. But I talk about, why does it light up orange? I mean, I would know that because I'm from here. Back roads, Auditorium Shores, Mount Benel, you guys get the point. Travis versus Williamson. Which means if I captured something in history today, I would include all these details in my letters because I'm from here. I've got knowledge. And then fast forward 200 years from now, if you read my letter and you read this historical document, you would go, well, Buck is clearly from Austin because of the knowledge profile. It's verifiable outside of his documents that those are historically true. Now, imagine this. Imagine if I did the same thing, but I was writing about Miami, right? I've never been to Miami. I've watched Miami Vice as a little boy. I watched that. Don't know if you did. I've watched CSI Miami with Horatio, Horatio, that guy. I've watched that, and I've seen the neon buildings and the beaches and the whole thing. And if I was to write a letter about Miami, I'd be like, hey, there's this Horatio guy maybe, I'd write all this stuff. But 200 years from now, if you were to read that letter, you would go, based upon the knowledge profile, it's clear this guy was making this up. That is extraordinarily important to think about because one of the major objections to the New Testament is the fact that the New Testament writers did not write these letters in that geographic location. Because what we know is that Mark wrote his letter in Rome. Luke wrote his letter in Antioch. John wrote his letter in Ephesus. Matthew wrote his letter in Judea. So how in the world, when they talk about Jerusalem and Palestine, how in the world can they get these things accurate? And this is why the eyewitness knowledge profile is so incredibly important. Because you go back, well, did they speak to the geography correctly? Did they talk about topography and the fact that Jerusalem is elevated? And even though you go north, you walk down as you go north. Did they know that? Did they know the agriculture and architecture and botany? And here's what's so cool about the New Testament. And I know there's a lot of information, but hang with me. What's so cool about the New Testament is it's not a bunch of sermons. It's not a bunch of philosophy. It's not a bunch of these epiphanies or these big old platitudes. No, it's a historical document. It's, hey, Jesus went from Jerusalem and he went to Nazareth and he walked over here in the Sea of Galilee and here's the winds and the winds of the Sea of Galilee and here's how they blow. And then it was Pilate and he was the governor. And then here's the flowers and here's the Mount of Olives and here's, the Garden of Gethsemane and all these details to go, okay, you've provided a historical document that we can do an exhaustive study on every single one of these and say, is this true? Even though the writers wrote outside of Jerusalem, did they understand? Were they part of this culture? Is it verifiable? And I'm just telling you, and this is where you've got to fact check me, but do the research. It's amazing the exhaustive evidence that doesn't cause us to question the New Testament as a result, but causes us to lean in and go, wow, there is no other work of antiquity like the New Testament. In fact, if you had to summarize this, one of the greatest summary statements is from this gentleman, or next slide, is from a man by the name of John Warwick Montgomery. He is a scholar, he is a lawyer, and here's what he says. To be skeptical of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all classical antiquity to slip into obscurity. For no documents of the ancient period are as well attested bibliographically as the New Testament. Bottom line, if you cannot put your weight and your trust in the New Testament, you dare not put your weight and your trust in any other work of antiquity. There is nothing we have in all works of antiquity in human history that holds a candle or even can compare to the New Testament manuscripts, which leads us to the bottom line. And why I say this, that you can trust the 27 New Testament documents because they contain accurate historical records of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, which means you are forgiven through Christ, which means you really do have a new identity in Jesus Christ, which means eternity is real, which means God is 100% for you. And that's important to think about, these documents, because they're powerful. And I would guess if we could all share our stories, part of the stories we would hear around this room is, somebody asked me to read one of these letters like Matthew or John, and I read it, and I'm just saying one thing led to another, and it just changed my life. I've heard so many of those stories. In fact, one of my really good friends that I met over a decade ago, her name is Jackie. And Jackie, when I was working at Dell, I met her 2 weeks after she became a follower of Jesus Christ. And she shared her story, and she said, Buck, it's just kind of the craziest thing. I was coming back from a business trip from the East Coast, flying back to Austin, and I was considering how to take my life. She was at that point in her life. She was successful. She had got to the pinnacle of most things that culture tells us to get to. She got to the pinnacle, and she said, this is what it delivers? This is all? Because I'm not going to spend the rest of my life chasing this. It doesn't ultimately satisfy. So she was planning on how she was going to take her life on this flight back from the East Coast to Austin. And as she was sitting next to this gentleman struck up a conversation with her, and this guy, got to hear her story a little bit, and he just said, hey, Jackie, one of the things I just want to encourage you to do, you don't have to do, but if you'd be willing, when you get home tonight, would you read the letter of John? John is a letter about this man named Jesus Christ. And so she decided, she said, hey, whatever, fine, I'll do it before, I go forward with my plan. So she reads the letter of John, and she reads about where Jesus says, I have come to give you life, and I've come to give you life to the full, which her heart had been so thirsty for. And then she begins to pray, hey, Jesus, if you are who you claim to be in this letter, would you reveal yourself to me? If you are who you claim to be, would you reveal yourself to me? And he did. And she became a follower of Jesus Christ. And then she tells me this story at Dell, and then I said, Jackie, the craziest thing, I'm about to, transition out of Dell. I'm going to start this church, and we really want to be effective at engaging people who typically don't go to church. And she was like, man, I'd love to be part of that. And she was part of North Point the first several years, and her fingerprints are everywhere. And then she moved to Florida, and now she's part of a church in Florida. And it's amazing to see the impact the scriptures have had on her life. So my question for you as we wrap up, and I honestly want you to think about this, I really do. When it comes to the New Testament, where are you at with it? In your personal life, where are you at with the New Testament? Is it something that you would say, yes, I trust? And if it is it something that you're wrapping your life around? Is it something that you have kind of said, hey, it is so trustworthy. There's no other work of antiquity like it. And it's this message from God to me about what he feels about me. And are you wrapping your relationships around the New Testament? Are you wrapping the way that you love your wife or engage and love your husband around the New Testament? Is this part of the fabric of your weekly rhythms? Where are you at with the New Testament? And if you're here today, or if you're watching or listening online, and you would say, well, Buck, I'm pretty skeptical about the whole thing. In fact, Buck, I've never become a follower of Christ, or I was at some point. I just walked away because the stories in the Bible, the whole thing. And you have honest pushback, and you have honest questions. If that's you, I love the fact that you're here, and I so love the fact that you're watching or listening online. But I do have a question for you, I really do. And it's going to sound really awkward and clunky at first, but I'll give you some context as to why I'm asking you this question. And the question I want you to think about is, do you honestly want to know truth? In your life, do you honestly want to know what's true? And here's why I ask this question. I think this is so incredibly important. Several years ago, I was meeting with a guy. We were having breakfast tacos. And we were meeting in a very similar conversation. He was asking questions about the Bible, and it's like any other religious work. So we were going through this, and we were talking about some theological things and different religions and all this. And we met for about 2 hours. And at the end of the 2-hour time, I looked at him, and it was at the point in the conversation to where I could be a little bit more forward. And I looked at him, and I just said, hey, so what is it? What is the thing that's preventing you? We've talked a lot about these different things, and we've come to a place of consensus on a lot of these things. And so what is the gap? What's that thing that's preventing you from being a follower of Jesus Christ? And no kidding, he kind of looked down, and he looked up at me and threw his hands up, and he goes, hell, Buck, hell. I guess I just want to do what I want to do. And I thought, that is brutally honest. He wasn't interested in discovering what's true. In his most honest, vulnerable moment, he said, I just want to do what I want to do. And I want to do what I want to do when I want to do it with whomever I want to do it. And honestly, I'm not interested in the truth. So my question for you, and I think you owe it to yourself to be honest to yourself, are you genuinely interested in the truth? And if you are, if you really are, and if you're going, Buck, I still got some questions. This whole New Testament thing, I got lots of things I want to poke holes in and ask questions about, or this whole Christianity thing, I've got some gaps. If that's you, then my encouragement and the thing I want you to do is this. If you have gaps trusting the New Testament, ask your questions for real. Go to mpaustin.com/Bible and be honest with those questions. Be forward with those questions. Don't filter them. Just ask your honest questions. Because the bottom line is this, is that you can trust the 27 New Testament documents because they contain accurate historical records of the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And maybe you hear that and you go, well, Buck, that's great, but that's not my pushback. My pushback is the Old Testament. I mean, the God of the Old Testament seems radically different from the New Testament. And what about the creation account? Are you serious? I'm going to buy the creation account? And what about the whole Levitical law and all these? Does that actually apply to my life today? And if that's your pushback or if that's the gap, man, that is fair. And I totally get it. And you got to come back next week because that's what we're going to talk about. Let me go ahead and pray for us. Father, thank you for today. Thank you that we can pause in moments like this and kind of change things up and get way more informational today. And Father, I just pray with the things that we talked about. I just ask that you would meet all of us, that you would meet our hearts and you would meet our minds. You know exactly where we're at today. And Father, whatever it looks like to take a step of trust towards you, would you open our eyes to that today and this week? And then would you please give us the courage to take that step? God, thank you for today. Thank you for how much you love us. In Jesus' name, amen. Guys, thanks so much for being here. I'll see you next week.